It's so good to see you all this morning. And I failed to mention, of course, the jar of change. It's something, a new tradition that we started here a few weeks ago. The jar of change, of course, if you fear change, leave yours here. And so if at any point during the message or during the rest of our service, I failed to mention earlier, but it's always there, you can see there's a lot of fear in our group. You can see that, in fact, there's a $20 bill in there, so I don't know what that person was dealing with that day. But it all goes to the food bank or to our Food for Kids program or some of the other mission endeavors that we have. So I invite you to feel free at any time. Just come on up, and except for the band. They can't do that. Not this time. Deal with it. So I put this joke online, and some of you responded, and some told me this morning they responded again, and I have yet to see all the different responses. Some of them are quite interesting, but it seemed appropriate as I was thinking through images that came to mind, free associating images that came to mind when I thought of the story of the prodigal son. So here's the joke. Gingerbread man, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, the runaway bunny, the prodigal son, they all run into a bar one day. And the bartender said, "What is this? A running joke?" I told my wife that I didn't think it'd get any laughs. She actually had this great idea. It was actually as the morning wears on, you'll see the running joke. Hopefully you'll get it as it comes along. But this really it struck me as everything's always moving, right? We live in a very mobile society. We move about a lot. We run a lot. We run toward things. We run from things. My heart is racing all the time when I get up and do things in public, like right now. My heart is racing. It's running. We run a lot. And it seems like that just is the normal kind of way of our lives. Yeah, there he is. But here's something about these images that I want us to think about this morning. What the story may be offering is a metaphor that is relatable today as it was 2,000 years ago. So I want to think with you about some of these associations. And some of you just piece it together as you're listening. The gingerbread man. You remember that story? How many of you? All of you? Most of you? Run, run, run as fast as you can. You can't. Or, of course, if you watch Shrek, the favorite line in Shrek, right? He looks up and says, "Bite me." Yeah, I almost had that up there. I just didn't think it was appropriate. But I said it anyway. Saved it for that. I think he actually bleeped the tape at that point of the video. We spend a good bit of time running, and like the gingerbread man, we're running. But here's the interesting thing about the gingerbread man. Why is he running? Just blurt it out. Why is he running? So he doesn't get eaten, right? That's what we always think. But that's not really what's happening. Go back and read it again. Look at when you go back and look at the versions, not the new ones, not the modern ones, but go back to 1800s, 1700s. Look at some of the earliest versions of this story. May have come from Norway. We're not sure exactly where. But some of the earliest versions, what happened is what you see in all of these great old myths or these great old folk tales. They're based in longing. They're based in desires that are human nature, part of who we are. And this couple, as the story begins, is an older couple, and they are childless and desire a child. So what do? They make one. That's the old myth of these stories. They make one, and they put it in the oven. They put it in the womb, okay? They bake it. And when the child is ready and the oven opens up, they don't try to eat the child. The child jumps up and runs. He's not running because he doesn't want to get eaten. He just bolts up and runs. Because we run. But what happens, of course, is that as he starts running, that's when he's trying to save his life. Because at that point, then his people and his animals and his other things see him. They want to eat him. And then, of course, he deals with the reality of life. So we're kind of like that gingerbread man, I think. I think some of us, we come out of the oven. We come out of people's expectations, our mothers, our fathers, they come together. We are the creation of someone's desire, someone's longing, someone's hope. But at the same time that we're the creation of all these possibilities and longing and hope and love and personal extension, at the same time, we are also the product of all the baggage and all the expectations and all of the other things that come along with that oven, right? I mean, all of those things are who we are. And so we end up finding ourselves sometimes running because we're chasing something. Sometimes we're chasing an expectation. Maybe it's one that we sort of are carried with us from birth. Maybe it's an expectation we've learned over the years. Maybe it's a social expectation. Sometimes we're running from baggage that we just kind of got inherited as we were heading out the oven door. So we run. We run all the time. And sometimes we don't even understand why we're running. We're just not trying to be eaten, trying to avoid being eaten. Forester Church. F. Forester Church. Some of you might know him. He's a wonderful writer. He was the minister of All Souls Unitarian Church, one of the oldest churches in the U.S., and he passed away about 6 years ago, I believe it was. He wrote this wonderful book, and I want to put it up here so that you might see the title. Oops, we'll go back one, so that you might see the title. Don't jump ahead of me now. So he had this wonderful book called Lifecraft, The Art of Meaning in the Everyday. A genius, just a wonderful writer, a great essayist, a great thinker, and a great man of spirit and devotion. This is how he begins the book he calls Lifecraft, making meaning out of our everyday. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about yourself. To one extent or another, the following is true. You are self-conscious about your appearance. You feel guilty about things you have done or failed to do. You sometimes have a hard time accepting yourself or forgiving others. You are insecure sexually. You are a less than perfect parent or a less than perfect child of imperfect parents, or perhaps one of both. You are a frustrated husband, wife, or partner, or you are frustrated not to be a husband, wife, or partner. You have secrets which you might betray, or which might betray you at any moment. However successful you are, you sometimes fail in ways that both matter to you and to your loved ones. And beyond all this, your life is stressful. Your happiness can seem fleeting. Your health sometimes insecure. You worry about aging, or perhaps you worry about dying. More than once, your heart has probably been broken by betrayal, or perhaps by loss. And however successful you may be, however deep your faith, when the roof caves in, you sometimes shake your fist at heaven, or perhaps you shake it at the fates, or at life itself, or perhaps you simply shake it in the mirror. And we beg for answers. He says, you beg for answers, you question why this, why me, why now? You wonder what life means. So it pretty well describes us, right? Not all the time, but certainly at some aspect of these we all identify with. Sometimes more than others. This story is a profound story that often gets misunderstood, I think. It gets hijacked by sort of the concrete in our midst, by the black and white, and I'm going to use this word, and it's a little strange word, and if you want to come up and put money in it, go ahead. We get hijacked by the dualists. And I understand that that's a hard concept for us to understand and grasp hold of, but it's a reality that we live in, and sometimes we need dualism. Sometimes we need things to be black and white, but the reality is that all of life is not black and white. We've already discovered scientifically how much we are connected, how deeply we are connected spiritually. We come to understand that. This story often gets hijacked by those kinds of dualistic thoughts, that idea that what this story is all about is that we're bad, we sin, we've run from God, and unless we figure it out and turn around and run back to God, then we're not going to get somewhere. That's one interpretation that often gets touted about this story. I think it misses the point. This dualistic worldview is that sort of idea that we are so easy with, this idea that there are two types of people, the people who think there are two types of people and the people who don't. There are bad people, there are good people. There are bad sons, there are good sons, like our story today. Goofus and Gallant, which I've talked about before. Highlights magazine, we're entrained as young children, right? We love this magazine. We read these wonderful little moral stories. Gallant, he puts up his dishes. Goofus, he puts his dishes under the couch. Gallant runs with scissors down, pointed down. Goofus runs with scissors upright. Gallant takes his binoculars, observes nature from a distance. Goofus wants to see what's inside a squirrel up close. We understand good and bad. The challenge is sometimes to realize they're oftentimes much more gray than black and white. And when we read this story as a typical moral story of debauchery, good behavior versus bad, or a theological tale of separation from God's forgiveness, in spite of ourselves, God forgives us, we miss something that's really, I think, at the heart of this tale. First of all, think about its historical setting, right? The story was written at a time after Jews had converted to Christianity, but they didn't call themselves Christian. They were the first Jews who were following Jesus. They were followers of the way. They were Jewish, though, right? They were Jewish, and so they practiced the Jewish traditions with some of Jesus' teachings, but they maintained Jewish traditions. But then there's this whole other group that's out there that also has been following Jesus and decides to follow his teachings and his way. But they're Gentiles, they're Samaritans, they're people that don't belong here. The story was about those folks. The good son, the one who's been there all along. The faithful son's been part of related to God and trust and followed God devoutly. And now you got all these other people who don't even know who God is, not the way we know God. Well, that's the young son. That's the prodigal. So in its own context, this story is a very profound story about inclusiveness, about everyone belonging. But it's difficult, right? It's difficult to include those other folks. We'll talk in a minute about how difficult it is to include the prodigal when he comes back. I have discovered over time that the prodigal son is much more about a waste, of thinking of ourselves as a waste, than it is about wastefulness. So it's more of an existential question. So, for example, when we think of how he lives a dissolute life, throws everything away, right? We've known people like that. I've been there like that. I've burned bridges. I've done bad investments. I've done wasteful things with my resources. I've littered. We live in a throwaway society, right? That's the way of our life. This story is not about that. This story is about an existential sense that we don't belong, that we're not connected, that we're a waste. It's about this sense in which we haven't discovered our real potential. And so we get lost in the running. But here's what I'm learning as I get into these latter years of my middle age. I'm learning, first of all, not that I need to be honest or kind or thrifty or pray a lot or read the Bible a lot more or be a very astute observer of society or be a good father or a good husband or even a good pastor. I'm not learning those things. I'm trying at those things, but that's not what I'm learning. Because you see, every one of those things are what keeps catching me up running. Every time I get caught up in those things, I keep running. What I'm learning instead is that what we love, what we attach our being to, is what we are. We are what we love. We are what we attach our being to. We are what we attach our living and our motivation and our deepest sense of self to. That's what we are. If it's shame, we live out of that. If it's fear, we keep living out of that. If it's expectation, we keep living out of that. We won't say it's love. It's hard to recognize it as love, but what we attach our life to is what we love. And that is who we are. And so if I live my life out of something too small for so great attachment, then I live my life out of fear or shame. Whether my attachment is a need for success or a desire for something greater, or my sense of shame, or my feeling that I should have been a contender, all of those things are loving and too small. We even love God, or the mystery that we call God, the very ground of our being, with so little attachment that we sometimes simply waste what is possible. Life is wasted on devotion to expectation and cold beliefs. In the time of politics, boy, that comes apparent. Life is often wasted in devotion to expectation and to cold beliefs. So the real meaning of this story isn't about the son at all. The real meaning of this story is about the father. The real meaning of this story isn't about the son's running off. It's really about the nature of God, the nature of mystery, the nature of the sacred in our midst. So that even when he decides and comes to his senses, I love that phrase in there, he comes to his senses. I've done that maybe once or twice in my life. I mean, really come to my senses where I could just simply go, this is okay. I think I know what I'm supposed to be, what I'm supposed to be doing. But that doesn't come very often. Coming to our senses is difficult. We live in a very cluttered reality. And there's a lot of running happening all around us. So it's really challenging. We sort of feel like limbing, right? You sort of start feeling like everybody else is running. I guess I should be running too. And it's hard to stop and get grounded. The story is about God's love. It's a story about the nature of reality as love. How many of you have read this book? You know this book? Yeah, raise your hand. I'm just curious if you know the Runaway Bunny, because I'm always amazed at who knows the book and who doesn't know the book. If you haven't read this book, you need to go read it. Now, there's two sides to this book. There's another side of this book that some people say is kind of a little dysfunctional, a little enabling, and I recognize that. But the Runaway Bunny is this wonderful little story about the bunny who, we read it to our kids when they were young and read it to our granddaughter, just like the gingerbread man. But this one's kind of different. He wants to run away. He says, I'm going to run away. And his mother says, well, you can go ahead and run away. He says, well, I'm going to become a fish. She says, well, if you become a fish, I'm going to become a fisherman in the river, and I'm going to catch you. He says, I'm going to become a rock at the top of a mountain. She says, if you become a rock, I'm going to become a rock climber, and I'll climb to you. And there's this constant, whatever you try to do, I'm going to do so that I'll be there. But it's kind of a chasing thing, right? Which is good and bad, all right? I mean, sometimes we go like, yeah, let the kid free, let the kid be. You don't want to kind of smother the child. But that misses the point, I think, kind of like the duality of this story misses the point. Because there's this wonderful verse that I love that only occurred to me as I read it again this last week. If you become a bird and fly away from me, said his mother, I will be a tree that you come home to. There's this wonderful passage in the Psalms. You remember it? Is there any place I can go to avoid your spirit, to be out of your presence? If I climb to the sky, you're there. If I go underground, you're there. If I flew on morning's wings to the far western horizon, you'd find me in a minute. You're already there waiting. We get so used to sometimes thinking in terms of God out there and forget that God is the thing, the source in which we move and have our being, the very source in which we live, that we are a part of God as much as God is a part of us. And that sometimes when we look out there and wonder, where is this ground of being, we forget to look in. We forget to stop and connect. The message here in this story is that we don't turn from our wicked ways in order to turn back so that we may be forgiven and received into the kingdom. The message is here that the very source of our being, the unfathomable mystery and grace of God, is grounded in love, and love is the source of that reality. So that the message is awake and love. Paul Tillich, who coined this first phrase, the theological phrase of God is the ground of our being. He was a philosopher and theologian that taught at Harvard. Died back in the 60s. He wrote in the margin, on the outside of this particular story in the Bible, he wrote in the margin, he said, if the prodigal comes back home, I hope he doesn't stick around very long. A strange thing to say, right? He just got back. What was lost is now found. Why would Paul Tillich write that? I hope he doesn't stick around very long. The reality is that we get tired of having prodigals back at home. Have you had that experience? Sibling comes back. You were the good kid. You did everything right. You stayed home. Here comes the younger brother or the big brother, screwed up everything, and you're saying, welcome back home. And you're loving him? What about me? I mean, we sometimes feel like that. This is the running joke part. You getting this yet? Not really. It's not. I wasn't sure if it worked, but I thought I'd try it. Yeah. Wonderful scene from Star Trek: Next Generation. Yes. Oh. No, I'm looking at a blank stare. Did you all not watch Captain? Anyway, all right, skip it. Okay. What I think Paul Tillich is saying here is that we recognize that love is at the very heart of our being. Then it is time to move on with a different purpose, a different kind of freedom. We are not free, ever free from our faults and shortcomings. But we are free from our need to be afraid of them. We are free from our need to feel like we have to be attached to those shortcomings. We are free from our need to feel like we have to judge others for their shortcomings. I'm going to end with this story. I had this amazing experience a number of years back when I was working in a camp called Camp 1 O'Clock, camp for kids with hemophilia. It was called 1 O'Clock because the blood needs to clot if you have hemophilia, and that's what you try to do, the medications and everything. So it was called Camp 1 O'Clock. And it was out in Georgia. At the same camp, because 1 O'Clock is a smallish kind of group of kids, they're about 120, and the camp holds close to 300. That same week was another camp holding its camp called Camp Breathe a Lot, a cystic fibrosis camp. Now, they don't hold camp anymore because of all the risk of infection and whatnot for kids with cystic fibrosis, but that had been their 4th year together. These two directors knew each other very well. They were good friends for the longest time. But after the first day, it was very apparent that something was going on with this camp. There was something wrong, something not working. The camp was kind of out of sync. There was tension. And if you noticed off in the distance, you would see the two of them kind of bickering off in the corner. And eventually, within the second day or so, you saw the staff of each of these camps getting a little tense, getting a little demanding. Why haven't you moved out of the space yet? We're supposed to be using this space too. There was just this tension that continued to build. And nobody knew exactly why. But eventually it trickled to the kids, right? Because they sense it, but they don't express it. They don't know what's going on. So with the kids, it was just a lot of crying. It was a lot of anxiousness. It was like a hyperactivity. Things were literally in this camp falling apart. Just little by little, things were falling apart. They'd have staff meetings, get it together. And you'd see these two directors just sitting there glaring at each other like, fine, we'll do it, fine. You know, you do your part, we'll do our part. And then all of a sudden, like 4th day, this is an 8-day camp. 4th day, early in the day, this woman shows up. She's a Native American Cherokee. She's from that region, been on that reservation in that area for years and years. Her family went back. Her name was Annalise, and it was like Lightfeather or something. She had a Native American name. She came out in Native American garb, and nobody knew why she was there. But they announced at breakfast there would be a horse naming ceremony, a spirit ceremony. Now, the thing that you would want to know about horses, if you don't know already, horses are profoundly sensitive animals. They are inbred with a sense of deep fear of being eaten. They feel like prey all the time. So they depend deeply and intimately on the ability to trust their setting. So anybody who's worked with horses knows that the way in which you work with a horse is you develop a deep, trusting relationship with this horse. And nothing will pass by this horse. If you're stressed out, if you're anxious, if you're mad, if you're controlling, all of those things, this horse is going to pick up on it. Horses will pick up on it. They get jittery, you get on their back, they're uncomfortable. Horses are highly sensitive to emotion because they need to be able to trust. And so this woman brought the horse out into the stable and lined up the two camps around the stable area. And she brought out paints, and then she described what was going to happen. This horse had not been named, and this was going to be a spirit naming ceremony. But what has to happen is that everyone has to be a part of this ceremony. This horse needs to trust the environment in which it's in. Everyone has to come forward and touch the horse. Well, the minute some of these folks came forward, the horse would get jittery. I mean, some kids were very calm, but some of the adults were very tense, angry. As soon as they get close to that horse, it literally would move. And she would say, Annalise would say, you need to step back about 10 yards, and I need you to start breathing deeply, and whatever you're holding on to right now, I don't know what it is, but whatever you're holding on to, you need to let go of that. And so you just see that happen time and again until after about 2.5 hours, this horse had calmed down and everyone around was still and watching. There wasn't any impatience. There wasn't any anxiousness. Everyone was just amazed at how this horse responded to people's touch or presence, depending on where they were. She did the naming ceremony. She painted the side of the horse. And here was what was really funny. At that point, when the horse had been named and the whole setting was calm, you literally could see this sense of wonder in everyone's eyes. Annalise stepped back from the horse, and the horse jumped and started running. Just on its own, just started running around the stable. That same way that if you've ever been out in a pasture and you've just seen horses run, they are playing because they are deeply connected to where they are with a deep sense of trust. And that's what this horse was doing. The rest of the camp was amazing. It had been transformed. And everybody there wanted Annalise to meet with them so they could all get a spirit name. So kids would line up during the breaks. They'd line up in the evenings. And she'd come to all the cabinets. Adults were doing the same thing. I got a spirit name. Everybody got, you can't talk about the name, right? Because only you know who you really are. You start trying to give that up and tell somebody else who you are, and maybe it's not so much who you are anymore. Only you know that deeply. How do we connect with trust to the earth, to creation, to God? The Middle Eastern poet Rumi said, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." How do we open to the presence of love? Sometimes we have to step back. It's hard. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we are bitter. Sometimes somebody did something wrong. They shouldn't have done it. Sometimes something wrong happened to us. It shouldn't have happened. Sometimes we've done something wrong and we feel bad and that shouldn't have happened and we're carrying it. It's hard. But the reality is, until we can learn to let go of some of that stuff, then perhaps we don't really connect to what's possible. Step back, breathe. Sometimes trying to smile. If I just asked you to smile, would you smile? It's hard, isn't it? And if you'll do this on your own, you're going to discover something. Our bodies are designed to be connected to love. Because the minute we smile, these nerve endings start kicking up. They start feeding neurons and neurotransmitters to the brain. And we feel better. And people around us start feeling better. Sometimes we have to stop back. I'm going to invite the band to come on up here. I always forget when to invite them to get up here. What we're reminded by in the prodigal son is this idea that if we stop long enough, maybe we can come to our senses. In a season of deep polarities, ridiculous polarity, right? It's getting almost comical if it wasn't so dang scary, the polarities that we're experiencing right now. How do we connect to love? How do we connect to that? Maybe we try to just come to our senses and pause. Maybe we try to say yes just long enough to let go of what we've been chasing after. And we'll find it. Amen.